With Victoria 3 having the ability to form Canada, I thought it was my civic duty to play the game and see if I could reach Confederation before 1867. There's definitely some historical inaccuracies to contend with, most importantly the fact that I don't think Francis Bondhead had a beard like this until he was way older, and I'm not sure exactly how well Presidential Republic really describes Upper Canada, aka the Ontario Beta phase. I'm from Ontario though, so we went with Upper Canada and began to reform our way towards Confederation. Step 1 was to try to improve education, which the Anglicans really weren't fans of. The goal here was to try to get the intelligentsia into power, figuring with my complete lack of experience in Victoria that there was probably a reasonable path towards improving quality of life and GDP this way, GDP being one of the things we'd need to improve if we wanted to convince Lower Canada to join. We needed naturalism research to confederate as well, so I got that out of the way pretty quickly. After our first election, I was able to add the intelligentsia to the government with their growing clout, though I still had to keep all of the other interest groups in place. Hoping to disrupt the influence of some of those other groups, I tried to push through census suffrage, but shockingly, all the rich people weren't on board with an expanded franchise, so instead I just wasted about 2 years of legislative time and made a bunch of people angry. Instead, we shifted towards enacting public schools, furthering our education goals, while radicalizing the still shrinking Anglican Church's influence. I started researching railways as well, since if you know anything about the first Canadian Prime Minister John A. Macdonald, you know he loved the 3 R's: railways, racism, and alcohol. Once researched and built, these do show on the map, so that's pretty cool. Beyond those trains, the map of Canada is going to be pretty sparse and boring, so we need all the help we can get. As the election of 1839 came and went, the government didn't really change much, though the clout of each group was definitely beginning to shift. Our efforts in education had made a noticeable impact on the intelligentsia's growth, and I also recruited a general with some pretty positive leadership traits from the intelligentsia, hoping eventually he'd end up as the party leader. Since I'm from Niagara, I know exactly how important wine is to the economy, so I switched to vineyards as soon as possible. June 17, 1844 became an important date as we finally took our first real steps in Confederation, merging Upper and Lower Canada into an even bigger Upper Canada, beating out the real-world Acts of Union forming the Province of Canada by about 4 years. Though much like that historical union, I did it without enacting responsible government, or even asking if that's what people wanted. I was actually expecting the political landscape to change a lot more when merging Upper and Lower Canada, but everything kind of just stayed the same. If we really wanted to make Canada early, we'd also have to get our universal healthcare, but without pharmaceuticals and with a government that believed no healthcare whatsoever was the best practice, that would probably have to wait. Uniting the provinces, aside from pissing off Quebec by just calling them more Upper Canada, was pretty bad economically at first, and with the other building we'd been doing, we'd run up a lot of debt. Luckily, our American neighbors were nice enough to adopt all of that debt in exchange for just a few favors, which I'm sure will definitely not come back to haunt us. We were still a bit too focused on economic recovery to really worry about expanding the Confederation at all, but even if we wanted to, Britain had been at war for several years now, which prevents you from being able to click that button. Instead, our attention was turned to the crucial election of 1847, where the new Free Trade Party really seemed to be inspiring the masses, while the Liberal Party looked like they may barely just get 3/4 of the vote. The intelligentsia had gone from junior partners with the Liberal Conservative Party in the prior governments to the sole members in power after this election. By now, I was really hoping to confederate some more provinces, but the British were still at war with the Dai Nam. With our long-standing policy of not investing in our military at all, I had no intention of actually trying to join the war and help. The war continued into 1848, which brought the issue of multiculturalism to the forefront. After an incident where we told schools to stop discriminating against the Cree language, we began working on legally enacting multiculturalism more generally, which passed surprisingly quickly before we moved on to the much longer process for separation of church and state. By this point, the war had completely bottomed out. No one seemed to want to be in it at all, so I thought we would definitely be approaching the end, and it certainly wouldn't be another 5 years before they'd finish. In better news though, the most prestigious thing to ever happen in Canada apparently occurred when a playwright wrote a play about reform, shooting us up the prestige rankings from 30th to 24th, which seems completely reasonable. This even helped with the intelligentsia's political position, and we embarrassed the leadership of the petite bourgeoisie and the landowners by not letting them shoot each other in a duel. This apparently super amazing play was what we needed to finally push through the separation of church and state, radicalizing the Anglicans for what I think was like the third or fourth time at this point. But since they only had about 1% of the clout and they'd shrunk to about the same proportion of the population, I wasn't thinking this would be a big problem. In 1852, rather than finish the war they already had, Britain decided to start yet another one, though luckily this one was pretty short. In the meantime, we'd started enacting privatized healthcare and poor laws, thinking any minute now we'd be getting a bunch of new provinces. Instead, Britain yet again started 2 more wars in 1855, though they were mercifully pretty quick as well. These last 2 wars coincided pretty closely with the 1855 elections, where the intelligentsia had a pretty sharp fall-off, while the trade unionists were beginning to grow significantly and got added to the government. Mercifully, the British finally decide to finish their war with the Dai Nam, and we can finally enter the second stage of Confederation. I thought we'd be getting New Brunswick, but instead we got all of the Hudson's Bay Company, bringing in Nunavut, which wouldn't exist as a territory in real life until 1999, the Northwest Territories, Yukon, British Columbia, Alberta, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, the rest of Ontario and Quebec, but crucially, the famous provinces of Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. From here, it's really just a matter of waiting for the modifier to drop so we can confederate the Atlantic provinces. But more importantly, we need to hope Britain can control themselves for like 5 minutes so we don't end up locked in another war. While we wait, I tried to get rid of child labor and enact compulsory childhood education, which had been super popular a few years earlier, though now it faced some unexpected opposition. Stanley, the intelligentsia leader, had decided that the best way to support the intelligentsia was to oppose childhood education. The characters in this game don't seem to live super long, so hopefully he'll be gone and we'll be able to do that soon. But for now, luckily Britain was able to control themselves, and we quickly reached the point where we could add the already unified New Brunswick and Nova Scotia into Confederation. Even Britain celebrated our achievement, and much like the true fathers of Confederation, we would soon press a button in-game and form the nation of Canada, with the weird blue version of the flag. While we'd managed to form Canada in 1859, several years before the target 1867 date, we were still lacking Newfoundland and Labrador, which we can probably convince Britain to give us at some point, and which didn't join Canada until 1959 anyways. The bigger concern is that over in Alberta, there was still a chunk of the province around Calgary which had been held onto by the United States. Our first goal of forming Canada may have been accomplished, but as the Socialist Labour Party gained ground in the 1859 election, our next goal of the Socialist Canadian takeover of the United States to rescue Calgary was only beginning. Thanks for watching, and a special thanks to the patrons for supporting today's video. We'll see if we're able to save Calgary or if Canada will fall in the attempt next time. Hope to see you then.